We are really honored to have one of our most important alumnas of the New School, who did her MA and PhD in our department. And Mariana is one of the most influential economists in the world today, and she's professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London, where she actually founded her own center. Now she's the director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is author of an infinite series of articles, and most importantly, she has really highly acclaimed books. The one that started off, let's say, her biggest fame was The Entrepreneurial State, that everyone knows about, of 2013. And then in 2018, she published The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy. Today, we're really happy because Mariana is presenting her latest book that we're really excited to learn more about. Mariana has innumerable international prizes. She's received numerous international prizes. Lately, an Italian award, Grande Ufficiale Ordine al Merito della Repubblica Italiana, which is one of the highest civilian honors. She received in 2021. 2020, she won the von Neumann Award. Then she won in 2018 the Leontief Prize for Advising and Frontiers of Economic Thought. So these are just some of the important awards Mariana received. And of course, another important thing that I would like to say before I give her the floor is that she's also very active in advising directly governments and other organizations. So now she's advising the president of South Africa, for example. She's in the Scottish Government Council of Economic Advisor. She's also the chair of the World Health Organization's Council on the Economics of Health for All. And these and many, many more. Apparently, she's also advising Argentina at the moment, and Chile, and the new exciting situation in Chile. So I would say we leave the floor to Mariana. We're really happy to have her. And we hope also to bring her for dinner very soon when she comes to New York. Thank you, Mariana, for being with us.
Thank you. I was just adding a slide. This is a terrible thing to do, isn't it? While you're while you're being presented, because it's something you said. Let me go back and share. Sorry. I will say, here, hold on. This is always the dangerous bit where you share all your emails or family pictures and then you get very embarrassed. Here we go. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much. It's just such an honor to be here with my family, because I really see the New School as my family. I was just saying to Anwar and Claude, I feel so lucky to have been trained at the New School. I still think it's the only place in the world where you can get proper heterodox economics as analysis, not just history of economic thought. And I was there in the heyday with, David Gordon, Anwar, Billy Semler, Alice Amsden, John Eatwell, Pierangelo Garignani, all the greats, Lance Taylor, and so on. And I just remember I wanted to go to the New School so much that the first year I just audited because I didn't get organized to apply. So I was living in Princeton with my parents after graduating from Tufts. And I would, I don't know why I'm telling you guys this, too much information, but it's still, just shows how much I love the New School. I had to make money, I guess. So I worked in Richardson Auditorium selling tickets, this wonderful auditorium in Princeton University, which is some of the best sound in the world. That's why the Emerson String Quartet record there. And I would work there, I don't know, selling tickets and helping the sound guys until 5. Then I'd run to the train station, the Dinky, this little train. I know Anwar knows about this train because he went to Princeton, which brought me then to Princeton Junction. And then I take the train to New York City, arrive there at night, and just be like a dream of taking all these amazing classes, especially Anwar's and Ross's on political economy, 204, 205. I still remember the numbers, advanced political economy, but also Ross's. And then I'd go back to Princeton at midnight and get back, Princeton Junction, then to the Dinky, and then ride my bicycle from the Dinky station to my parents' house with this air, flowing in my hair, and just thinking, I am so lucky. And then I finally applied, got in, and did the, proper master's and PhD, but boy, was it inspirational, and it continues to be. I feel like so much of the kind of inspiration that I received there, but also the desire to implement new theory and to make change happen because of how dysfunctional our current way of doing capitalism is, definitely I am sort of where I am, and you know, being able to set up a whole institute, which is a proper department, it's its own department at University College London, because of the training, the inspiration, the grounding that I received in new, you know, economic thinking at the New School. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I hope that wasn't kind of too random of an introduction. Anyway, so yes, so what I'm going to be talking about is my latest book, but I did kind of add in some slides about, you know, how I kind of arrived to some of this thinking, especially around value, because, you know, of course, that's what you get when you go to the New School. You actually completely rethink value. But the context in which I wrote the book, and in some ways, well, yeah, I did start writing it, of course, before COVID, but it just felt so much more urgent in terms of really putting public purpose and public value at the center of political economy, but also policy design. And I think what the COVID moment, unfortunately, has revealed to us is just how badly prepared we are. And, you know, as everyone knows, I'm sure this is not going to be the last virus. As the permafrost melts, all these new viruses are going to be coming out. And of course, there's a very strong link between climate change and this health pandemic. And just so badly prepared in every single way, from, you know, that first lockdown with the test and trace system, where so many countries just literally were not able to govern that process. In the UK, we managed to outsource it to Deloitte, which the last time I checked is not exactly their, you know, on their expertise list. In fact, it was a total failure. But also the vaccine. It's not enough to have a vaccine or these 8 vaccines that we have unless we vaccinate the entire world. And as Clara mentioned, I'm currently working with the World Health Organization, and the head of it, Dr. Tedros, who's become a good friend, he refers to this as vaccine apartheid, where you have, you know, basically 80% of the vaccines being hoarded by, you know, the global north, and many people in Africa still not having received their first vaccine. And you can't solve this with like just charity and philanthropy and, you know, all the solidarity we actually do need right now of shipping over vaccines. But we have to ask ourselves, why don't we have the capacity in so many parts of the world to also produce the vaccines? Why is it we've structured intellectual property rights in general? This is obviously a generic general problem, not just around COVID-19, where there's so much value extraction and we're misgoverning health innovation, which then during a pandemic kills people, right? Anyway, so obviously we know that with the health pandemic, unless everyone's vaccinated, we all remain unsafe. And even just from that opportunistic, selfish side, because we will all be safer once everyone's vaccinated, the fact that we still can't get our acts together is just incredibly revealing. But also the digital divide, you know, during the lockdown, inequality rose in many parts of the world, but also in that very fundamental way, because many kids and students didn't continue to have access to their human right to education. You know, so all these different problems have been just kind of compounded. But I think unless we learn how to do things better on the back of this crisis, it's just going to be a huge failure that the history books will write about. And of course, you know, COVID happened on the back of all sorts of other crises, the financial crisis, which many countries are still feeling the waves of. And in fact, we are about to, I think, personally, have another financial crisis if you look at the level of private debt around the world. But the climate crisis, you might remember that in January and February, before the March lockdowns, the papers and the news were all full of the fires in California and in Australia and in Venice, the part of Italy, or close to the part of Italy where I'm from. There was those famous floods, literally that February, just before the March. And as Greta Thunberg, a young teenager, continues to say, you know, what do you do when your house is on fire? You don't sit there and debate, should I stay? Should I go? What should I do? You get out. And if you look at the IPCC report that just came out on climate change, we are not getting out of this crisis at all. In fact, it's quite terrible if you look at just how much continues to be spent around fossil fuels, even during the COVID-19 recovery period, where something like 56% of the COVID recovery funding allocated to energy companies actually went to fossil fuel projects in the European Union. We continue to subsidize, at least until last year. I think things are starting to change now, with the Green Deal program, but just in 2019, 55 billion went to subsidies to fossil fuel companies, and the US is actually even worse than Europe. And so what the book starts off with is, my God, can we just stop then patching up the system? Not only should we be getting out of these crises quickly, but we really need strong reflection on why they are occurring in the first place. So we stop just patching things up. And in fact, economic theory, I think, doesn't necessarily help, because literally the way that policy is designed is by patching things up, by fixing market failures. You're just constantly putting bandages here and there, as opposed to actively trying to shape and create a very different type of economy. Clara, do you see the slides? I just saw you squinting. Do you guys see the slides? Yeah, good. So why is deep change needed? I'll start off with this, but most of the talk is going to be actually on what to do about it. How can we redesign policies with kind of problem solving, challenge orientation, mission orientation at the center? I'll say something about the underlying theoretical analysis that I mainly developed through my previous book, The Value of Everything. But really, the book was written in some ways with a sense of urgency. And as I'm Italian, a bit of sense of a recipe book, like, all right, enough debate. Here's what we got to do in terms of actually really redesigning our policies in such a way where these problems are at the front and the center. And so just why deep change is needed is we need to always remember, of course, that the economy is an outcome of decisions we make. There's nothing deterministic in the system. I really don't believe in the concept of secular stagnation, as though we have to be stagnating because of who knows what. And there's all sorts of people who've written about secular stagnation. Stagnation itself and the way that we the kind of economy we have, one that's not inclusive, one that's not sustainable, one that goes from crisis to crisis, is very much also an outcome of the decisions we make within our corporate sectors in terms of how we govern companies, but also in terms of how we govern our public sector. I think we have real misgovernance, this idea of just at best fixing market failures, and also the relationship between all these different actors in the system is very problematic. Which I'll get to in a second. But first, just some, kind of brief overview of some of the deep structural issues that I think we need to be remembering when we look at the problems in modern day capitalism. I'm sure most of the people listening, if you've been trained at the New School, know this more than anyone else, but just because it's useful to make sure we're all on the same page. So first of all, the financial sector itself has been increasingly financialized. So finance is financing finance. If you look at, for example, all the money that was actually created after the financial crisis in order basically to save the capitalist system from falling apart, mainly, but not only through central bank activity, most of that money went back to finance, insurance, and real estate. This graph here from Andy Haldane, who was the chief economist of the Bank of England, reflects on just how much financial intermediation has outpaced the growth of the rest of the economy, gross value added in the economy besides finance and agriculture. And as long as that finance was actually, finding itself back into the real economy, one could argue that, all this financial intermediation is creating new products, which then help the financial sector do its job to, foster growth and innovation in the real economy. But that's simply not the case. What we often have is that finance is simply creating also more credit in the economy, at the same time that in the case of consumers, real wages aren't increasing. So what we saw also with the COVID pandemic, to stimulate the economy in the UK, for example, we had all these help to buy schemes, give people even more mortgages, which has just increased the level of debt. There was also lots of loans given out during COVID-19 to small businesses that have been struggling, but also large businesses. So this kind of piling on of credit in the economy without actually directing that credit to really foster and expand productive capacity is one of the reasons why we currently have a very vulnerable global financial system where, just like back in 2007, 2008, the level of private debt to disposable income is actually back at record levels. And of course, that is what caused the financial crisis in terms of that bubble bursting. You would think that excess level of private debt to disposable income and the fact that the bubble might burst very soon would be on the front page of newspapers like the Financial Times, or even political platforms, whether it's of the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, but there's literally no discussion about this. And this is a deep structural problem. So finance is financialized, and second problem, business is overly financialized. It's also overly extractive in terms of actually extracting value out of the economy. People like Bill Izanik have written about this. You see in the numbers, for example, of share buybacks and dividend payouts in many sectors. I was just looking at Pfizer's numbers today. Pfizer, which is now world famous because of the vaccine, its total share buybacks and net income, and dividend payouts exceed its R&D spending, and in many for many companies, it actually exceeds net income. In other words, dipping into capital reserves to redistribute income to shareholders, with this idea that that's good for the economy, maximizing shareholder value. In fact, that lack of reinvestment of profits into the economy, you see this if you look at macroeconomic figures of business investment, one of the components of GDP globally on trend has been falling. And one of the reasons this is also very important is when you hear people talk about the robots, digitalization, artificial intelligence, it's taking jobs away. Well, really? If you read David Ricardo, as I'm sure everyone has, if you go to the New School, back in 1821, I think it was, Principles of Political Economy, chapter 31, called On Machinery, he was already talking back then about the kind of labor displacing, and of course Karl Marx as well, labor displacing effect of technological change. So already back from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, technology, mechanization, industrialization has been labor displacing. What is recent, right? There's nothing kind of inevitable in this. What is much more recent is that, I should say, as long as the profits from the 1800s onwards, as long as the profits were getting then reinvested back in the economy, even though there was that labor displacing effect, new jobs appeared, new sectors appeared, you had almost creative destruction in terms of the reinvestment cycle, as long as profits were being reinvested. Basically from the 1980s onwards, with this obsession about maximizing shareholder value, I would argue that that has been one of the biggest culprits, if you want, of on inequality in terms of value being extracted out, not being reinvested back into productive capacity, not being reinvested back into human resources, but also in some ways technological development in some sectors. And this kind of brings us back to the physiocrats who were so concerned about this in the Tableau Économique. This is a Keynes, who I read for the first time at the New School. And it's just so interesting to think about these issues around corporate governance today in terms of, how they were looking at the sterile class that were, taking money out, rendering the system itself, the reproduction, this word sterility, reproduction of the system sterile, and hence unsustainable. And, this issue around the financialized kind of short-termist extractive private sector, first of all, it's not true of all private companies, and that is important to say. We shouldn't be dogmatic about it, but it is an issue that, at least in theory, large corporates are talking about. If you go to Davos, the World Economic Forum, you hear a lot about the need for change, to put stakeholder value, not shareholder value, at the center of company governance, of thinking of purpose, the purpose-oriented company. But unfortunately, this is, currently mainly just blah, 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 using, again, Greta Thunberg's accusation around climate change. In other words, we don't really see, besides some kind of sustainability and kind of climate targets in terms of the E of ESG, we don't really see much change in terms of things like financialization. And that really, I believe, requires a different theory of value. You can't have stakeholder value without really rethinking, where does value come from? What is that collective contribution of all sorts of different actors in the system? So if stakeholder value really was kind of nested within this alternative understanding of value, that's not the Michael Jensen kind of shareholder value maximization understanding of where value comes from, then I think we would already be kind of semi on the right path, and I'll come back to that later. But surely it can't just be about redistributing some profits back to workers, and some back to communities, and some into kind of climate kind of areas. It has to really be about how we produce in a different way, how we produce value, how we innovate together in a different way, and that's not happening right now. I think there's a lot of talk around stakeholder value and not much of a walk. And the third problem, right, financialized finance, extractive business sector, the government. The government has huge issues. Not only the kind of old school Reaganite, Thatcherite idea, government should just come in, do its little thing, and then get the hell out of the way. All the problems are due to government. That's kind of the old, stuff that we don't even have to talk about. The real problem is that even the more progressive understanding of what government is for is quite static, quite inertial. It creates inertia within governments. This idea that at best, government can fix different types of market failures is, I think, a huge problem. It helps maybe sometimes create some incremental change, but coming back to those crises that we have, financial crisis, climate crisis, health crisis, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which of course we have since 2015, really outlining huge areas that require improvement globally, the 17 goals that the UN helped foster and every country has signed up to. You can't really fix your way towards solving those goals. And it's quite striking that, so I assume everyone knows what I'm talking about in terms of market failure theory. So the idea that, markets are a great way to organize our system, but every now and then fail because of positive externalities. So too little investment in things like basic research and development. So government has to come in and fix that problem. The opposite of negative externalities, so pollution that's not included in the cost structure of companies. So government comes in and taxes it through, say, a carbon tax. Information asymmetry, so small little companies don't get enough finance. Government comes in, provides SME financing, and so on and so forth. It's not that these failures don't exist. It's that if you see the role of government as fixing problems here and there, you will literally always be too little, too late. So we almost design into the design of policy this kind of reactive mode, or even just fear mode, that you think there might be a market failure, so you do something. As opposed to, even public goods. It sounds good, 2 words, public good, but the fact that it's just seen as kind of filling the gap of something the private sector hasn't done doesn't, I believe, really create a strong framework for how public, private, but also civil society organizations, especially in areas like health and energy, can work together towards objectives, right? So this is a correction, not an objective, of how we can actually work together, innovate together, produce together, with the dynamic division of labor, and kind of sharing risks and rewards and so on. Again, something I'll come back to later. But just to say, this is, I think, a very problematic way in which we think about the role of the state. So these 3 problems, which I just very briefly, sort of superficially went through, is, I think, one of the kind of underlying pillars of what we need to do to change the economic system so that we're not always in reactive mode. How to rethink finance, how to rethink business governance, how to rethink the state. And in my previous 2 books, I wrote quite a bit about that. In The Entrepreneurial State, it was really also about kind of debunking myths around the role of the private sector, the role of business in places like Silicon Valley. Our smartphones would be stupid and not smart had we not had government investment in areas like the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, and even more so, that government investment didn't just happen by kind of throwing money at the system, helicopter money. It happened through purpose-oriented organizations. DARPA, which everyone knows, it was the lead investor in the internet, didn't invest in the internet because they were like, oh, we need the internet. They invested in the internet because there was a problem to solve. And the problem was getting the satellites to communicate. Internet was the answer. Same thing with GPS, funded by the Navy. The problem was knowing where the ships were, are in our seas. GPS was an answer. So that idea of kind of a purpose-oriented public institution that is not only well-funded, but also has a kind of investor of first resort, not lender of last resort kind of role, but in a dynamic innovation system, working obviously alongside the private sector, but not there just to facilitate, enable, fix market failures, lender of last resort, all these incredibly boring ways that we've gotten stuck into thinking about the role of the state. In the second book, The Value of Everything, I asked, what does then this mean, these lessons, for how we understand value, how, collective value creation, or using words from the World Health Organization today, collective intelligence. How do we govern an innovation system to truly not create rent-seeking in the pharmaceutical companies, but create and foster that kind of collective intelligence? How do we govern the patent system in order to deliver on that? So it just requires also to be nested, as I was saying before, in a different understanding of value as a socially created through particular types of institutions. So the kind of the new norms and institutions, but also governance principles that we need if we want to reform the system. It can't just be done by, oh, don't do austerity, invest. We actually have to, really better understand ideas around value, the difference between value creation and value extraction, the difference between rents and profits would be a useful place to start. And as again, many new schoolers know, a lot of what we end up counting as profits are actually rents, but it's very hard to distinguish the two if we don't kind of start with underlying principles about how we understand value. And in this third book, it's really, as I mentioned in the beginning, much more about coming back to this idea that we have objectives to solve. What does it mean to have both a new type of political economy, but also a new type of practice on the ground that can be focused on going to the kind of core, the problems that we're facing, but also, again, bringing that notion of public purpose and stakeholder value at the center of the system, as opposed to at best being kind of a corporate governance gimmick. And, very much at the center of this is also an understanding of the economy, as I mentioned before, as an outcome. There's no kind of forces that have to make, companies short-termist, no forces that have to make governments purely market fixing. And, I was personally very influenced by the work of Karl Polanyi, who, in his incredible historical analysis showed that even the notion of the free market, which we know is often kind of a bogus notion if you look at, what people actually understand in terms of the free market, but even the free market as we kind of understand it would never have happened. The market mechanism would never have happened without a very strong watch by the administrators who kind of like designed the system itself to work in a particular way. So, understanding markets as outcomes of decisions we make within public administrations, corporate organizations, and so on, then brings agency into the system that we can actually, design or at least steer the market mechanism to foster particular types of outcomes, at least towards greater inclusion, greater sustainability, but it will never happen on its own. And of course, John Maynard Keynes, I think, is obviously an inspiration to many of us, but I think he's also very misunderstood. It wasn't about digging ditches and filling them up again. Yes, we need public investment in moments of, recession so they don't turn into depressions. But that idea that really what government should be doing is also truly doing what's not being done at all, and kind of also the need to reimagine what kind of society do we want to live in, and fostering a real discussion between different stakeholders about, what kind of economy do we want and what does it mean, whether it's for a city, a region, a nation. That just requires a level of imagination and of fostering a discussion between different actors and creating spaces for that we often don't have if we just see like the role of the public sector as, counter-cyclical government spending. If we look at Roosevelt, for example, in his recovery programs compared to today, he invested also in artists. And if you think about, the role of the creative arts in helping us to imagine a different type of world we want to live in, that's incredibly important for helping us steer the funding that we know we need for a recovery program. And that itself, begs the question of how we can make sure that the funding and the money that's being created during such a difficult period is also really helping us to truly build back better in terms of invigorating and catalyzing that discussion of a very different type of economy that we need because of these kind of ills in the system that I discussed before. And that doesn't happen if we just think it's about infrastructure, roads and bricks and buildings and interest rates are low. We also require a very different type of discussion. And as I already mentioned, a lot of this also does come back to big questions around value. And this is something I thought about a lot in the previous book, which is that unless we go back to that value discourse, we end up not reversing the current problem that we have, which is that we basically have a theory of exchange and prices that determines the kind of value that we include, for example, in GDP. And confusing price with value has very much, a very concrete impact on things like, how we govern our organizations, what we count in GDP, how we price medicines, value-based pricing, which basically allows the prices of drugs to whatever the market can bear. Anyway, these are all questions that I kind of explored in the value book, which I won't go into, but just to say that for me, these two kind of, questions are very much interlinked. How we understand how value is created in the economy, how we steer value creation a particular way is not unlinked to these questions around accounting, literally that confusion of price with value. Unless we confront that, then we remain stuck. And we allow, again, large pharmaceutical companies during the COVID pandemic to say, don't regulate anything in the health sector, or that will impede innovation, by not actually having an objective understanding of who's doing what and how value is being created in the system. It becomes very hard to actually have proper then ex post regulation, because we don't actually have a strong narrative about that collective value creation in the first place. Anyway, so what I do in the Mission Economy book is to say, we can do so much better, and we have to stop getting stuck. And we have to, especially given that, as I mentioned, every country has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, find a pathway, an investment pathway, a production pathway, and stop overly relying on philanthropies to fix problems, but also relying on public policy to fix and tinker on the sidelines. And what I found just so interesting in doing the research for the book was that, the inspiration was that 50 years ago, now it's 51 years ago, humanity did something incredibly hard together, lots of different actors in the system, which was to get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. That was the whole kind of Sputnik Cold War moment where the US wanted to beat the Russians to the moon. But what was interesting with that, which I actually hadn't appreciated as much as I later did also in doing the research for the book, is how much care was put into some of these issues I've just talked about. How to actually organize a system through lots of different actors, because it wasn't just NASA, it was lots of different private companies, to work together towards an objective with the contracts themselves between public and private designed in such a way that was truly purpose-oriented, with the problem to solve together, with contracts that had things like no excess profits. In other words, we're not going to turn this into a gambling casino. But first of all, just to kind of go back on some of the points I just made on government, what was really striking was the language that was used. Kennedy's famous, sentence of, we're going to do this because it's hard, not because it's easy. That is just not how public policy is framed today. It's often in terms of, as I already said, fixing problems, but also in terms of facilitating, which from Latin comes from the word easy, facile, Italian, right? Versus doing something hard together, welcoming uncertainty together, experimenting, that kind of willingness to take on risks in all sorts of organizations, including, and in this case, principally, the public sector. It's just not at all how we think about climate. It's definitely not how we look at some of the biggest challenges of our time. And that willingness to experiment, that willingness to take risks was just so obvious also from the beginning of the Apollo program, where they literally had no clue how to get to the moon. So literally, we're doing this because it's hard, not because it's easy. They started almost from scratch in terms of thinking, the different methods through which one could get there. And even though they eventually landed on this lunar orbit rendezvous, there was lots of failure along the way. So that willingness to fail, the willingness to trial and error and error and error, to learn by doing. And on the first, during the Apollo 1 program, which ended in that tragedy where 3 astronauts died, what was interesting is that it became a reason to restructure that organization. I mentioned before that some of the biggest technological changes of our time have actually occurred through purpose-oriented institutions like DARPA. Well, NASA had to become purpose-oriented. In other words, it had this target, but because it wasn't structured within its public organization to be purpose-oriented, it had huge communication failures. And one of the astronauts, Gus Grissom, on the day of the fatal fire, yelled, "How the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" Because he couldn't hear what was being said by Mission Control Room. So instead of just saying, "Oh, that's because it's a bureaucracy, it's because of government's inertial, it's slow, we need to rely on the private sector," they repurposed or reorganized the organization by bringing in George Mueller from Bell Labs, who created these project managers, each with their teams, with strong delegation. But the idea was constant communication between the different departments. And if we think of anyone who has an experience in working with governments globally, this is often used to say, oh, governments are, slow and inertial and every department does their own thing. Well, that's because we've designed it that way. And the idea that, again, at best, you're fixing a market failure versus actively co-creating, co-investing, taking on risks, welcoming uncertainty, there's no justification actually to change that way of thinking about government. And so this need for constant communication between those project managers was the need because government was actually there for doing something incredibly ambitious and hard and with the private sector. So, over 400,000 people were actually in one way or another employed, throughout the system working in the Apollo program. And what was interesting was that need to do it in a cross-sectoral way. I work a lot with, government industrial strategy. So this is something that interests me a lot. Cross-sectoral. It wasn't just about aerospace. So NASA didn't just work with aerospace companies. They worked with companies in nutrition and electronics and new materials. The whole software industry can be seen as an outcome of that moon landing, created all these different spillovers along the way. So these dynamic intersectoral economy-wide spillovers are, again, something that I think would be super interesting for Keynesian economists interested in issues like the multiplier, the maximum multiplier that we can actually foster in a system for every dollar, euro, pound of public money. How much does GDP grow? Well, it's not, again, just by investing, putting public money into the system, by fostering and catalyzing and crowding in new forms of collaborations between many different sectors, the multiplier effect is actually greater. And what's so interesting is that we also require, but we don't have, proper metrics through which to capture that, not just through that aggregate multiplier, but literally through these dynamic spillovers across sectors, which are really hard to capture through, say, cost benefit or net present value calculations. I think someone's dog is barking, so everyone can mute. The other thing is that I found so interesting was that they really, as I mentioned before, took care in designing the contracts. So it's quite interesting because today with concepts of the Green Deal, the deal requires a contract. Literally, that's what the deal means. We need to negotiate. We need a new social contract between public and private. And NASA knew that. The first thing they did, Ernest Brackett, the head of procurement, changed how NASA did its public procurement away from cost plus contracts towards fixed price, kind of design like challenges with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. So a lot of these spillovers I just mentioned, the camera phones, baby formula, home insulation, software, that happened because there was all these problems that needed to be solved, and the procurement structure itself helped to foster that bottom-up experimentation. So there was sort of a top-down planning of what needed to be done, but very open on the how, but the contracts designed into it, this ability to really foster as much collaboration and collective intelligence throughout the system. And they also, I mentioned this before, put in this no excess profits clause, which I just find fascinating, because I would argue that today in the space sector, if you see what's happening, it would be incredibly beneficial if we truly had a much more clear understanding how a lot of the success of people like Elon Musk or Richard Branson in space today is on the back of huge amount of previous public investment. And there's no real understanding of sharing both in the risks and the rewards in that enterprise. And there's very little understanding of what is the actual purpose. What are we trying to do together? So the contracts themselves, and I worked with NASA in recent years, the contracts themselves almost become an end in itself. There's all this obsession about commercialization. And it's actually built into the NASA language. Whereas if you look back at the Apollo program, no one talked about commercialization. And yet there was so much commercialization. So, by actually focusing on a mission, a challenge, and organizing the system to be truly collaborative and designing that social contract in a fair way actually produced a huge amount of commercialization on Earth. And it's interesting how actually by obsessing about that, we get just a lot of, extractive and problematic relationships today. Another thing that Ernest Brackett focused on a lot was the need for the public sector to invest within its own brain. So there was a very interesting quote in one of his writings where he said, if we don't do that, we will get captured by brochuremanship. Very interesting word if we think about today, captured by PowerPoint. And so his point was, we won't even know which private sector companies to work with. We literally won't know how to write the terms of reference coming back to this issue of contracts needing to be well written. Think of Caterina Pistor's work, really important law professor at Columbia, Code of Capital. That the code itself, the legal contracts themselves have been written in some ways to allow all this extraction to happen. Well, so interesting that NASA was aware of that they thought, because they were already seeing some of this outsourcing of public sector capacity and this danger that this need for collaboration was also then required kind of what management speak would call absorptive capacity to even understand one's landscape in order to also foster dynamic public-private partnerships. And yes, it cost a lot of money. At the time, it was 25 billion. In real terms today, 300 billion. But as I mentioned before, the real value is that catalytic kind of crowding in effect that it had across the whole economy. Really important, coming back to Keynes's point of really doing what's not being done at all and fostering those types of collaborations in the system, as opposed to at best thinking about countercyclical funding. And so what the book does, and I think I have less than 10 minutes to go here, so let me just kind of go through this a bit quickly, is to say, well, my God, if we could do this 51 years ago on such a hard problem, getting to the moon and back in a short amount of time, why do we not apply that same kind of mission orientation, challenge orientation, outcomes oriented budgeting, care to organizational competence and purpose orientation within the public sector for the problems that every country has, again, signed up to, which are these 17 SDGs, which are not missions, by the way. These are just very, very broad challenges, but each and every one of them can, of course, become, and this is sort of my big point when I talk to policymakers, as ambitious and inspirational as the moon landing was. And so this is some work I did with the European Commission, and this is kind of the practical part of this talk, saying, look, there's no lack of discussion about what the goals are, right? We've got the SDGs, or some people call them grand challenges, or we can call them inclusive growth, sustainable growth, but unless we transform this talk about the challenges into kind of moonshots and missions that require lots of different sectors to work together with government, and government leading, setting, kind of helping to set those directions and fostering discussions about what these missions might be, but especially then getting our hands dirty with the contracts, the procurement contracts, the grants, the loans, the bailouts, the recovery funds, to foster bottom-up experimentation towards goals, then we're simply not going to, fight climate change. We're definitely not going to have a less extractive type of economy that just increases inequality. So the contracts themselves fostering this kind of sharing of risks, sharing rewards, but especially using innovation policy, industrial strategy, procurement policy to really foster that cross-sectoral and interdepartmental, but also interdisciplinary type of collaboration is what this kind of mission-oriented approach tries to get governments to think about. So just as an example, one of the SDGs 14 is about life underwater. And so making it very clear that the mission itself would have to be something like a plastic-free ocean, getting 80%, 90% of the plastic out by so-and-so year, which requires not only getting the plastic out, but completely different things going in the first place. What's interesting to me is how this mission itself is actually one that a lot of people know about, on the back of, coming back to my point before about artists, that great documentary by David Attenborough, Blue Planet, where that last episode focused a lot on all the plastic in our waters and got a lot of kids thinking about it. I've got 4 kids. They all know about the plastic problem. Schools talk about that problem. And so that need to also really rethink what these missions are so they can inspire, in the same way the janitor in NASA said, I too am trying to get a man on the moon. So inspiring, catalyzing, reimagining. I don't think it can just be done through great policy engineering. It does actually require a lot of citizen engagement. And this isn't my area, so I don't know why I'm obsessing about the arts bit, but I do actually think that a lot of the reimagining what we're even trying to do together, and making sure that that is as an open discussion as possible, is important. Gil Scott-Heron, of course, during the moon landing, had this famous poem, The Whitey on the Moon, spending all this money, in space, when actually we have all these problems of racism and poverty on the ground. And while that's a very important point, one of the reactions by this guy ahead of NASA, when he was also accused of that after the Apollo program by a Zambian nun. He said, well, actually, a lot of the solutions we have on Earth have also come from periods when we kind of lifted our gaze and actually went after the big problems. So both the Gil Scott-Heron point, which is incredibly important, which is grounded problems. And, I work a lot with cities. So getting city actors across, mayors, especially through their convening capability, bringing different actors together to think about what those missions are, but also really lifting one's gaze to foster as much cross-sectoral interactions and collaboration is one of the key kind of points here. Implementing missions requires a completely different mindset. I've already mentioned it's about shaping, not fixing. It's about having government as an investor first resort, not lender of last resort, but also a portfolio mindset. It's not about putting all one's eggs in one basket, kind of the old picking winners idea that it's about choosing a sector or a technology. It requires flexibility and adaptability, and that's very hard to do if we don't actually retrain the civil service out of the old school new public management, public choice theory way of thinking about government. So it does require, again, a different kind of training and curriculum. That's why I set up this whole Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, to rewrite literally the curriculum that is used to train civil servants. It's about also rethinking how we evaluate these investments. As I already mentioned, very siloed ways of doing this currently in many ministries of finance that wouldn't capture those dynamic spillovers along the way. So cost-benefit analysis, net present value are very static. How could we value that kind of, fostering of collaboration, collective intelligence across the system? I've tried to bring this approach also to many countries who tend to, in the old way of thinking, just have a list of sectors that they think they're going to go out there and fund, like aerospace, quantum computing, and so on. This idea of a mission-oriented or challenge-oriented approach puts the missions and the challenges themselves at the fore, and then backtracks and redesigns the policy in order to deliver on the goals themselves. So instead of choosing sectors, like in the UK, when I helped them redesign their industrial strategy at the time, they had aerospace, automotive, life sciences, finance, the creative sector. And this kind of list here of 4 bold challenges that then government would be responsible to redesign their policies to deliver on them and to foster that different type of public and private. Well, we tried. Then Brexit happened, and all the smart people in government we were working with were sent over to the Brexit team. But just to give an idea, with Future of Mobility, which was one of these, actually having a mission, and this was one that the team that we worked with in government thought about, having a sustainable, universally accessible travel that was congestion and emission-free, zero accident system. Just the fact the word 100% accessible travel in this future of sustainable mobility system was there. Some of those bottom-up projects would have to come in areas of disabilities. Public banks, we can design them just to hand out money to whichever company is hurting. Well, that's not a very smart way to design a public bank. This notion of mission orientation means that the bank itself, public banks, which we know are important, especially but not only in developing countries, provide patient long-term finance to those organizations that are willing, so picking the willing, not picking winners, work towards these missions. And this is quite important for issues also around conditionality. So the example I often give is how the German public bank, the KfW, helped the steel sector in Germany only with the condition that the steel sector was willing to lower its material content, which they did, to repurpose, reuse, recycle, not because they went to Davos to talk about purpose, but because they had to in order to get €1. The Build Back Better scheme, I think, in the US right now talks a bit about that, but that level of conditionality at the center of government support that requires a change in corporate governance, so limiting share buybacks, or a change in production systems to be more sustainable, is just a completely different mindset. And in France, it's quite interesting. The Minister of Finance actually created conditionality for the bailouts to Renault and Air France, had to commit to lowering their carbon emissions. Whereas in the UK, we just kind of give out money to companies to commercialize, to help industry to be business friendly, completely condition free. And so EasyJet received 600 million recently with the COVID-19 recovery without any condition that it actually adapt. I have more slides, but I'm just going to be quick and just say that some of the work that I've been doing in London is quite interesting because of the citizen engagement point I made before. at the level of literally the neighborhood. So Camden, which is where I live and where UCL is, what's been interesting to me is to see how the leader, the Camden labor leader, Georgia Gould, who is the councillor, has created not only some of this conditionality, which I don't have time to talk about, but has brought citizens to the table ex ante to work with the council on issues around clean growth by not only talking about, retrofitting homes, but actually bringing resident associations or citizen assembly to the table to even debate and discuss what does it mean to live together in a more sustainable way. And I think in an era of polarization, think of, the Trump America or Brexit England, or think of Ottawa with the anti-vax campaign, these issues of citizen engagement in purpose-oriented policy that, yes, has the conditionality, that has the purpose orientation, but also has space for new voices, coming back to Gil Scott-Heron's point, to the table to design, to even think together what is our ultimate goal, is, I think, the hardest bit. And for me, it's just been a huge kind of learning experience. This is the French finance minister that I mentioned before. I'll just maybe finish because I began with COVID. There's no time like today where some of these issues are really important. As I mentioned in the beginning, the vaccine is not the mission. Globally vaccinating the world is the mission. This is why I accepted to chair the WHO Council, World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All, where we have people like Jayati Ghosh, who I know you all know, Stephanie Kelton, Vera Songway, who runs the UN Commission for Africa. They're all women, 11 women in the council. And the idea of the council is start with the goal, health for all, and work backwards and design the economic system, the intellectual property rights, the public-private collaborations, the budgeting, the capacity on the ground to deliver on that goal. It's very different from, for example, Jeff Sachs did a lot of work with the UN on health and the economy, and the idea, it's very important, invest in health and it's good for the economy. The idea of putting the goal at the forefront and then redesigning the economy to deliver on the goal is just a bit of a mind shift. And of course, these ideas of the people's vaccine to actually design the governance of the intellectual property rights to make sure that it is not as extractive or is not extractive at all as it is currently would be an example of that. And I think in the end, and the only reasons I talk about stakeholder value is because that's a lot of what the corporates are talking about. Larry Fink, who writes his letter every year to his shareholders, I really believe that some of these notions of putting purpose, collective intelligence, missions at the center of how different actors actually work together is the only way to begin with really experimenting this different notion of not shareholder, but stakeholder value. But that's not about corporate, just about corporate governance. It's actually about how value is collectively created between these different actors. And I just thought it was so interesting to go back to that kind of moon landing on how something that difficult would have never happened had it just been put a lot of money into aerospace, or let's go to the moon and let's do it with the private sector. It had to actually be designed at that level of the kind of nitty-gritty procurement and sharing of the rewards and fostering that bottom-up experimentation. And the last chapter of the book just kind of unpicks what this means for how we think about value, which I've talked about already, how we think about markets as not fixing but co-creating, about dynamic capabilities within our civil service, which has been outsourced to large consulting companies over the last 50 years, outcomes-based budgeting, instead of just handing out a bit of money here and there and hoping for the best, a pre-distributive, not redistributive, well, also redistributive, but not only redistributive take on inequality, getting the conditions right between the different actors, instead of picking up the mess afterwards, a purpose-oriented partnership, that notion of collective intelligence, and that issue I mentioned at the end around Camden and participation and open systems that can truly be co-designed. I think that's also very important for modern day trade unions, which, for example, talk about the just transition. So as we transition to a greener economy, we need to make sure that workers aren't, in quotes, left behind, that they're invested in, so they have these green jobs. Well, yes, of course, that's important. But the voice of labor needs to also be at the table in that ex-ante participatory way of even discussing what is green, who's deciding, who's setting the agenda. And I think it's not just about labor. It's also, if we think of Fridays for the Future, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, this era where these social movements have been so important. If we think of the last decade, what does it mean for these open systems and purpose-oriented systems to also have those different voices of what are we even trying to do in the first place? This is literally my last slide, just to say that it does fundamentally also require a different narrative and story of what policy is for. Coming back to my critique of market failure fixing, this is the inside the brochure of the institute I run. So co-creating, not fixing, welcoming uncertainty, not just de-risking, picking the willing, not picking the winners, tilting towards a direction, not leveling the playing field, which somehow is also in the policy speak, but doing so in that real way to catalyze that multiplier effect as much as possible. Thank you. Sorry, I think I've gone over by 3 minutes, but happy to answer questions.